Hey, I'm Margaret. I'm 32, living in this tiny apartment that's way more full of books than furniture. And I work as an archivist at the city's historical society. It's quiet, peaceful, the kind of life I chose to keep myself sane, far from, the chaos of my family. But, well, sometimes even the quietest life gets interrupted. And I ended up in a situation with them that I definitely didn't see coming. Anyway, before we get into that, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It's kind of amazing how far these stories can travel. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and honestly, my phone hardly ever rang. So, when it did this time, I froze a little. It was Olivia, my sister. Her voice came through bright, chirpy, almost painfully so, and for a second, I wondered if I'd misheard. She was telling me, with that trademark loud enthusiasm, that she'd been talking to Mom and Leo and realized, apparently, that they hadn't done anything special for me in ages. Special, I held a fragile glass plate negative in my gloved hand and blinked. This was new territory. The last time my family had paid attention to me, it had been for some milestone of Olivia's or Leo's, or one of Mom's fundraising galas where I basically existed as background wallpaper. I mean, me, Margaret, the quiet, bookish sister. They didn't exactly celebrate me. I paused, trying to sound neutral. Showing too much excitement or skepticism had always backfired, and I didn't want to give them ammo. I forced a casual tone. Yes, the promotion at work, the head archivist thing, they knew about it, but I could almost hear Olivia treating the title like it was some quaint relic she had stumbled across. They were talking about celebrating me. Really, it sounded almost surreal. Olivia went on, describing this dinner at Aria, a fancy new downtown restaurant that, from everything I'd read, was practically impossible to get into unless you had, the right connections. Which of course Leo had. The kind of place where appetizers cost more than my weekly groceries. My stomach twisted a little at the thought, but I tried to push it down. Maybe, just maybe, they were trying. People could change, right? Maybe this was one of those rare moments. Still, skepticism clung to me like a stubborn shadow. My mind raced with all the ways this could go wrong. I had to keep my expectations measured, keep my tone neutral, and above all, prepare myself for whatever performance my family was planning. And then Olivia added that they expected me to dress nicely. Chic, fashionable. I exhaled slowly. This wasn't exactly my usual librarian cardigan and sensible shoes vibe, but I promised I would go. The rest of the week became a hum of anxiety and cautious anticipation. I tried to tell myself they were sincere. My promotion wasn't flashy in the traditional sense, but it was important. I was in charge of preserving the city's documented history, a big responsibility. Meaningful work. I even bought a new dress. Simple, elegant, dark blue silk. Comfortable, but still appropriate. An investment. Yes, but maybe a necessary one. Maybe this dinner was a step toward bridging the gap between my world and theirs. My dad called the day before the dinner quiet, calm, the kind of man who had spent 40 years choosing peace over confrontation. Are you sure about this, Maggie? He asked, gentle as ever. I told him Olivia sounded sincere, maybe finally seeing me as more than their weird little sister. He sighed, and I could hear the weight of those years in that sound. Well, have a good time, he said. Know that I'm proud of you, no matter what. Just that small reassurance felt like a life raft, grounding me as I tried to navigate the storm I was about to walk into. And then Friday came. I got ready slowly, imagining, maybe, that this could be a warm evening, sitting around the table, laughing with them, talking about my work and having them actually listen. A fantasy, yes, but for a fleeting moment, it felt possible. I took a ride share to avoid downtown parking chaos, dressed in my silk dress, heart flickering with a mix of nervousness and a tiny spark of hope. Aria was everything I had feared and expected: towering glass facade, minimalist yet imposing interior, the quiet clinking of cutlery that somehow sounded like wind chimes. Hostess at the front desk, impossibly tall, dressed in all black, gave me a polite but slightly pitying glance. She handed me a garish neon green wristband, like something from a cheap festival, labeled boldly limited guest. My stomach dropped, my hope evaporated. This wasn't a celebration, it was a setup, a performance, and I was its unwitting star. My beautiful dress suddenly felt absurd, a costume in a play I didn't audition for. I held out my wrist as she fastened it around me, feeling the weight not as paper, but as humiliation. Walking into the dining room, every head didn't turn, but in my mind, a spotlight shone directly on me. My family was there, laughing, champagne in hand, completely absorbed in themselves. Olivia, radiant in a glittering cocktail dress, gesturing wildly. Leo, smug in a designer suit, surveying the room. Mom, beaming, soaking in reflected glory. Dad, quiet, slightly uneasy, catching sight of my wristband with a flicker of concern. I approached, the waiter giving me a polite rundown of the limited guest rules. House wine, non-alcoholic drinks, domestic beer only, no food. Just the punchline of a cruel joke. And yet, despite the sting, a small, almost imperceptible determination began to build. I had spent a lifetime absorbing their casual cruelties. Tonight was different. This was deliberate, premeditated, but in that moment, I realized maybe, just maybe, I could play this game too. Calmly, deliberately, preparing myself. I let the scenario sink in. I would not crumble. I would not react the way they expected. And somehow, as I adjusted to this strange, humiliating reality, a spark of something clarity maybe started to flicker inside me. It was the quiet beginning of a plan, one that would let me reclaim this night in a way they never, ever anticipated. Walking up to Arya, my heart was already doing this jittery little dance, a mix of nerves and that tiny glimmer of hope I was trying to convince myself was real. The glass facade towered above me, sleek, minimalist, intimidating. Inside, the dark wood, brushed gold accents, and that almost painfully hushed atmosphere made it feel less like a restaurant and more like a museum where whispering was mandatory. The clinking of cutlery sounded like wind chimes in my ears, each delicate sound amplifying the surreal weight of what I was about to face. The hostess at the front desk was impossibly tall, impeccably dressed in all black, professional, practiced. The kind of person who could make you feel simultaneously welcome and like you had no right to exist in that space. Her eyes flicked to me briefly, and I caught a trace of something, pity recognition of a minor disruption in her otherwise perfect evening. I wasn't sure, and I didn't want to linger on it. She gestured politely and asked for my name. I said quietly, meeting her gaze as evenly as I could that I was meeting my family and the reservation could be under Olivia, Leo, or Eleanor. Then she reached under the counter and pulled out a small, unassuming object. And there it was, a paper wristband, neon green, garish, clashing horribly with the sophistication of the surroundings. Printed in bold black letters were the words, "Limited Guest." I froze. My hands, which had been gripping my purse strap, tightened slightly. The warmth I'd been holding on to for this evening evaporated instantly. A small gasp might have escaped my throat, but I forced it down. Shock twisted into humiliation, a tight knot in the pit of my stomach that made my chest ache. I'm sorry, I managed, my voice barely a whisper. "What is this?" The hostess smiled, polite but not really warm, and said in that smooth, neutral tone professionals adopt when they're trained not to show emotion. "The host of your party requested that we give this to you upon arrival. If you'll just hold out your wrist." And just like that, the reality hit me. The warmth of my previous hope. The idea that maybe, finally, they were trying. It wasn't a genuine gesture. This wasn't a celebration. It was a performance, and I was being handed my costume. The dress I'd agonized over suddenly felt absurd, an ironic prop in a cruel play where I didn't even know the lines yet. The wristband dug lightly into my skin, its neon hue mocking me, a symbol of exclusion masquerading as hospitality. I forced myself to exhale, trying to maintain a steady outward composure even as my mind raced. Every step into the main dining room felt surreal, like I was walking through a dream that had turned grotesque. My family's table was perfectly positioned in the center, a large circular booth upholstered in plush velvet, all of them laughing, holding champagne flutes, utterly immersed in their own little world. They hadn't even noticed me yet, and in a way that made the moment even more surreal. Their obliviousness only amplified the sting of the wristband around my wrist. Olivia, radiant in a glittering cocktail dress, was gesturing wildly, recounting some anecdote I didn't catch. Leo leaned back smugly in his designer suit, swirling his champagne and surveying the room as if it belonged solely to him. Mom was beaming, eyes darting around to see who was watching them, drinking in reflected glory. And Dad, my quiet, gentle father, was seated slightly apart, a glass of water in front of him, his expression careful, measured, just catching the neon flash of my wristband and registering the oddity with a subtle narrowing of eyes. I approached slowly, shoulders straight, head held high. A waiter intercepted me, young, kind, tired-faced. His expression didn't change as he saw the green band, but his body language betrayed a subtle tightening, a recognition that he'd been briefed. "Good evening, miss," he said, calm and polite. "Welcome to Aria. I just need to quickly go over our limited guest policy with you." Limited guest? The words echoed in my mind like a bell I couldn't unhear. It wasn't just that I was excluded. It was formal, corporate, official. They'd gone through the effort to legitimize this cruelty. The evening wasn't about me. It was about reminding me of my place. And the precision of it, the wristband, the labeling, the procedural explanation was almost artful in its cruelty. "The package does not extend to any food items," the waiter continued, "including appetizers or entrees. Beverages, however non-alcoholic drinks, house wine, or domestic beer are included." I absorbed the words slowly, letting them sink in. My stomach sank further. I had been invited to a dinner to celebrate me and was not allowed to eat. It was audacious, breathtaking, designed not merely to wound but to humiliate, to demonstrate control. I felt the weight of it in my chest, a curious mix of anger and disbelief. Even as the initial sting flared, a quiet clarity began to emerge. The family I knew, the one that thrived on self-absorption, performance, and hierarchy, had overplayed their hand. They had assumed I would react predictably, silently absorbing the insult, maybe even blushing, retreating into a corner. But something inside me shifted, a click of understanding. This wasn't just a dinner, it was an invitation to engage on terms they thought were absolute. They had defined the rules. They hadn't accounted for me seeing the full picture, understanding the system, and, well, playing it in my own way. I slid into the booth next to my father, his eyes flicking to mine, a mixture of recognition and subtle concern. He could see the wristband. He could see the situation for what it was. And yet, he didn't intervene. Mom leaned in, her perfume overwhelming, rings cold against my arm as she whispered, trying to frame it as a harmless formality, a practical matter of high-end restaurant procedure. But her words only confirmed what I already knew. They knew. All of them did. And they had orchestrated this charade with meticulous care. Olivia and Leo's eyes tracked me as I sat. Flickers of anticipation, predatory curiosity almost, expecting a meltdown, a quiet retreat, an acknowledgement of my subservient place. They wanted a show. They wanted me to perform my assigned role. But inside, calm settled over me like a shield. Years of subtle cruelties, of casual disregard, had trained me to absorb, to observe, to calculate. This was different. This was deliberate, and I could respond with intention. I adjusted my posture, forced a light, calm exhale, and allowed a small, serene smile to touch my lips. Not a forced, pained smile, but one that carried a quiet assertion. I was present, I was aware, and I was not going to crumble. The room's muted grandeur, the deliberate exclusivity, the wristband, they were all part of a system they thought I couldn't manipulate. And that, I realized with a thrill, was exactly where they had miscalculated. As I glanced at each of them, the expectant, the oblivious, the smug, I felt a subtle surge of something powerful clarity. This dinner, this premeditated slight, was no longer a trap. It was an opportunity, one they had unknowingly handed me with every meticulously chosen detail. The surreal atmosphere, the precise cruelty, the garish wristband, even the hushed clinking of cutlery, it all combined into a canvas upon which I could paint my own narrative. I could follow the rules, yes, but I could also bend them, leverage them, and perhaps reclaim the evening in a way they would never, ever expect. And so, despite the sting, despite the humiliation, despite the surreal, almost absurd quality of the scene, I felt something like anticipation, not fear, not resentment, but a focused, quiet excitement. The kind that comes from realizing you hold more power than anyone around you suspects. I adjusted my wrist, straightened my back, and took a slow breath. The night had begun, and I was ready. Sitting at the table, I felt like I was in a completely different world. My family was completely absorbed in themselves, each person performing their little acts of indulgence and self-importance. And I was almost invisible. Olivia chattered on about her brand's latest campaign, making sure her phone was angled perfectly for selfies while sprinkling in phrases about authenticity and vulnerability. Every few minutes, she paused to snap another picture, probably checking likes already. Leo, of course, had the loudest voice, narrating stories about clients, cars, commissions, all with this air of superiority that made my chest tighten. Mom leaned in at intervals, pointing out social connections, whispering about people she'd seen at charity events or fundraisers. It was a loop of self-sustaining ego, a private ecosystem of performance I was forced to witness. And me, I sat quietly, hands folded in my lap, nodding occasionally, giving just enough acknowledgement to not appear completely invisible. But my mind was spinning. Every story, every exaggerated laugh, every meticulous display of wealth was being cataloged. I noticed the way they ignored me, how the neon green wristband seemed to cordon me off, not as a guest to celebrate, but as a spectator to their little theater. It was absurd, a bit surreal, watching them so engrossed in themselves while I processed the scenario with this quiet, calculating calm. Leo's stories were almost comical in their obliviousness. He gestured wildly with a buttered breadstick, talking about haggling over the price of a sports car, lecturing on the nature of class, while conveniently forgetting that he sometimes called Dad for help with his rent. It was like watching a cartoon, each movement exaggerated, every phrase infused with a self-importance I could almost taste. Olivia, meanwhile, was mid-monologue about her struggles and transparency for her followers, pausing only to edit a photo of her lobster dish. The entire dinner was like a performance within a performance, and I was the quiet observer who finally saw the backstage mechanics. Mom, in her element, was identifying people around the room, whispering to Dad and Olivia about who they were, how they were connected, what events they'd attended. She was orchestrating little moments of superiority, framing herself as socially omniscient. My father, as usual, remained quiet, focused on his plate, but I caught the occasional glance he gave me. There was a flicker of concern, perhaps an acknowledgement of the absurdity of the wristband, but he didn't intervene. He left me to my own devices, letting the evening unfold. I had to keep my external demeanor neutral, calm, pleasant, just enough smiles and nods to blend into the room without drawing attention. Internally, though, I was noting everything, how they valued appearances, how they interpreted generosity, how oblivious they were to the people around them who weren't performing for an audience. The contrast between my quiet, deliberate life and the chaos of theirs was almost dizzying. But I kept a steady focus, observing patterns, cataloging reactions, noticing the gaps in their assumptions. Every laugh, every exclamation, every dramatic pause was an opportunity for me to map the terrain. The neon wristband, the way the waiter addressed me, the complete disregard of my presence, it was all data. And with each piece, a strategy began to form in the back of my mind. I realized that the very system meant to isolate me, to humiliate me, could be leveraged. If I understood the rules, the boundaries, the expectations, I could use them to my advantage. The clarity was almost intoxicating. I could see exactly how far I could bend this scenario without breaking it, how I could play within the lines drawn for me and yet subvert their entire plan. Occasionally, I sipped the allowed beverages, letting the cool liquid ground me, give me something to do while the table carried on. My presence was a silent statement of composure, of calm observation. I noticed the smallest gestures, the way Leo's hand hovered over a breadstick as if it were a scepter, the way Olivia's eyes sparkled with reflected light from her phone screen, the precise tilt of Mom's head as she whispered, "Social commentary." I absorbed it all, creating a mental map of their behaviors and assumptions, a blueprint of their little world. The dinner conversation was entirely predictable, Leo comparing his successes, Olivia framing her social media as a journey of vulnerability, Mom cataloging her social interactions like a curator of an exclusive museum. They never once mentioned my promotion again. That supposed reason for the gathering had vanished from their consciousness, replaced by their own narratives. And in that moment, I fully understood my role in this charade, this silent, smiling accessory, a prop to make their celebration seem less narcissistic, while maintaining the illusion of generosity. It was infuriating, yes, but also strangely liberating. The absurdity of it allowed me to detach, to see the scene not as a personal attack, but as a mechanism. I could play along, I could observe, and I could plan. The rules were explicit, the expectations clear. They thought they were in control. They thought I would react predictably, and in their arrogance, they had not anticipated that I could sit quietly, smiling, taking mental notes, and begin formulating my own quiet, measured response. As I watched Olivia laugh at her own jokes, her phone in hand, I realized how fully consumed she was by performance. Leo's booming voice narrating another tale of luxury, oblivious to the irony of his own situation. Mom, orchestrating social awareness like a maestro, and Dad, quietly present, aware but unwilling to intervene. Every detail fed into the strategy forming in my mind. I could see the gaps, the blind spots, the assumptions they'd built this evening upon, and I could exploit them. I just had to wait for the right moment, keep my composure, and stay calm. So, I leaned back slightly, letting the mask of the gracious, quiet guest settle over me. I nodded, sipped my drink, allowed small interjections here and there that didn't betray any internal calculation. And all the while, I knew exactly what I was observing, exactly what I could do. The wristband, the exclusion, the pretense of hospitality, all of it was a tool. I just had to play it perfectly. And as their laughter and chatter filled the room, oblivious to the fact that I wasn't just quietly humiliated, but quietly plotting, a small, controlled sense of satisfaction began to bloom inside me. For the first time that evening, I felt powerful. As I sat there, quietly observing my family, the edges of a thought began to form in my mind, an almost mischievous little spark that I hadn't allowed myself to entertain before. The neon wristband, the rules about what I could drink and what I couldn't eat. It wasn't just a symbol of exclusion. It was a technicality, and technicalities could be exploited. I leaned back, taking a slow sip of the house wine, feeling the cool liquid give me a tiny moment of clarity. If they had explicitly defined the limits of my participation, then perhaps I could bend them within those bounds without anyone having the faintest clue. It was, in a way, brilliant. I waited for a lull in the conversation, a pause where my absence wouldn't be immediately noticed. The timing had to be right. I couldn't draw attention to myself prematurely. When that small window arrived, I smoothly rose from the booth, letting my posture remain composed, almost serene. I caught a few quick glances from Olivia and Leo, but their attention was still fixed elsewhere. Perfect. I made my way across the plush carpet toward the bar, feeling like a spy moving undercover. Every step was deliberate, measured, casual, but inside my mind, calculations were spinning like gears. The bar was dimly lit, an oasis of calm compared to the dining room. Soft jazz played, low enough that it didn't carry to the tables, giving the space an air of secrecy. Behind the counter, the bartender Arthur, I learned his name, quickly was polishing a glass with a methodical precision that suggested experience and patience. His eyes flicked up briefly at me, noting the green wristband, the unmistakable marker of exclusion. I could almost see the recognition in that brief glance. He understood the rules, and perhaps the situation without me needing to spell it out. "Good evening," I said, sliding onto a bar stool with calm composure. "Quite a system you have here," I added, holding up the wristband slightly for emphasis. Arthur's expression remained neutral, but a subtle acknowledgement passed between us. A silent understanding that I was about to bend the rules in a way that adhered to their letter, if not their spirit. "Well, my patrons have requested that I enjoy some drinks on their tab," I continued, voice light and casual, masking the thrill under layers of politeness. "And I am a very grateful guest. But I have a small request of my own." I leaned slightly forward, lowering my voice, ensuring no one else could overhear. I had to frame this as logical, reasonable. Within the rules, they wouldn't notice the exploitation if it sounded procedural, efficient. I explained the plan step by step. The wristband allowed me house wine, non-alcoholic beverages, or domestic beer. That was explicit. The rules hadn't accounted for price, vintage, or pairing restrictions. That's where the leverage came in. I could order whatever I liked within that category, as long as it was linked to the table number. And if I handled it with precision, not only could I enjoy what I wanted, but I could subtly influence the evening for my family without them suspecting a thing. Arthur listened carefully, his movements slow and deliberate as he polished another glass. I could see the subtle flicker in his eyes, the brief spark of comprehension. He knew exactly what I was planning, and I suspected he appreciated the cleverness. I continued calmly, explaining that I didn't want to constantly run back and forth, didn't want to disrupt the dinner. Linking a tab directly to the table made perfect sense. I argued, efficient for everyone involved, and certainly within the technical parameters they had set. It sounded reasonable, it sounded practical, it sounded like I wasn't challenging the system at all. Arthur considered it for a moment, eyes briefly scanning the dining room, then back to me. There was a pause, long enough to let suspense coil in the pit of my stomach. Finally, a tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. "That makes perfect sense," he said, voice flat but approving, much more efficient. He typed briefly at his terminal, swiped a blank card, and opened a new tab linked to table 12. "All right, miss. Tab is open. What can I get you to start?" I felt a surge of exhilaration, a thrill I hadn't expected so early in the evening. This was working, carefully, deliberately. I began. My selections weren't just about pleasure, they were about establishing this system I could exploit throughout the night. I chose wines, rich, expensive, legendary vintages, each order escalating in value but perfectly within the permissions of my green wristband. Each glass, each pour, became a calculated act, a subtle subversion hidden in plain sight. With every drink, I visualized the dynamic at the table, the obliviousness of my family as they carried on in their insulated bubble of self-importance. They would see me smiling, compliant, part of the ritual, unaware that I was orchestrating the evening to my advantage. Every detail was deliberate, the timing, the selection, the calmness in my tone. The brilliance of it was in its subtlety. It adhered to the rules, obeyed the letter of the restriction, but inverted the spirit entirely. I kept the conversation with Arthur minimal, precise. My instructions were clear, calm, unassuming. I wanted him to understand the setup without making it obvious to anyone else. He nodded along, a professional but also an accomplice in a way that felt exhilarating. The power of exploiting a system so rigidly defined, so explicitly constraining, without anyone realizing it, that was intoxicating. It was almost like turning the rules into a secret weapon. As I sipped my first selection, feeling the subtle warmth and complexity of the vintage, I realized the full potential of this plan. I could enjoy the evening, observe, and maintain my composure, all while the technicality of the wristband ensured my freedom within the framework they had imposed. Their attempt to humiliate me had created an opening, and I was stepping through it with a quiet, calculated delight. The rules were explicit, the expectations clear, and in that clarity, I found opportunity. Opportunity to claim control, to bend the system cleverly, and to turn a setup into a stage for my own subtle triumph. And as I glanced back toward the table, watching their oblivious engagement, I felt that thrill again, the realization that just maybe I was about to play this evening smarter than they ever imagined, all while appearing entirely compliant, entirely polite, entirely the limited guest they had envisioned. The plan, once set in motion, was intoxicating in its simplicity and audacity. I started small, ordering a glass of the Shade d'Yquem, one of the most legendary and expensive dessert wines in the world. The bartender, Arthur, raised his eyebrows at the choice, a flicker of surprise crossing his otherwise professional composure. I smiled, casually, almost apologetically, as if it were a mere suggestion. The truth was, it wasn't just a drink. It was the first move in a delicate game of strategic compliance, a quiet demonstration that I could adhere to the letter of their rules while bending the spirit entirely. I carried the glass back to the table, heart racing with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Olivia, mid-laugh at some quip of her own making, barely noticed the golden liquid in my hand. Leo, engrossed in a story about his latest car sale, waved vaguely in my direction, assuming the drink was part of the package he had so meticulously arranged. Mom leaned slightly forward, eyes scanning the room as she whispered about the social connection across the restaurant, entirely oblivious to the subtle subversion sitting beside her. Dad, as always, remained quietly attentive, a slight knowing look flickering in his eyes as if he had glimpsed a hint of what was unfolding. The first glass set the tone. I sipped slowly, deliberately, letting the richness of the wine unfold on my palate while maintaining the serene, composed expression that masked the thrill coursing through me. The family continued their performances, unaware that the small victory had already been claimed. The act of drinking what I wanted, fully within the parameters they had established, felt almost revolutionary. It was a quiet, controlled rebellion wrapped in politeness and precision. When the opportunity arose, I excused myself briefly, murmuring a light laugh about needing to stretch my legs, a casual line that allowed me to leave the table without raising suspicion. I made my way back to the bar, where Arthur was ready, as if he had anticipated my next move. He had, in fact, understood the game from the very beginning, and there was a subtle sense of camaraderie in the way he read my intentions without a single word being exchanged. I laid out the next selection, calmly, choosing vintages that were both rare and astronomical in price, each one carefully considered for maximum impact without crossing the boundaries of the limited guest rules. Each time, Arthur's initial flicker of surprise softened into a small, conspiratorial smile, a recognition that I was exploiting the system with elegance and subtlety. My movements were measured, deliberate, controlled. There was a rhythm to it, a choreography that contrasted sharply with the chaotic indulgence of the table I would return to. Back at the booth, I set down each new glass with the same serene composure. My family, completely absorbed in their own narratives, did not notice. They toasted, clinked glasses, sipped, and complimented each other on the flavor, utterly unaware that the $200 or $300 per glass liquid I held was far beyond the house wine they believed I was limited to. Olivia leaned in to edit yet another photo, snapping away at her lobster, while Leo gestured wildly with a piece of bread, narrating the finer points of class and entitlement. Mom whispered about an acquaintance they had noticed at another table, her gestures filled with social calculation. And there I was, smiling, sipping, and enjoying the quiet thrill of my unnoticed, strategic rebellion every 20 minutes or so. I found another subtle excuse to return to the bar. Each trip was part of a larger design. With a small, polite remark, I requested the next legendary vintage, always within the letter of the restrictions, always linking the tab to the main table. Each time, Arthur's slight nod or subtle smile acknowledged the unfolding plan. The rhythm became almost meditative. Drink, return, observe, smile, repeat, and the family, caught up in their oblivious indulgence, never suspected a thing. By the time my third round came, I decided to expand the plan to include a touch of playful revenge, a small act that would hit the sweet spot between poetic justice and subtle mischief. I spoke quietly to Arthur, suggesting that perhaps the family might enjoy a rare champagne, something truly extraordinary. He raised an eyebrow in surprise, and I allowed a serene smile to mask my internal thrill. The 2008 Salon La Mesnel Blanc de Blancs, a legendary champagne, was selected. Its price tag alone could have made my family's collective pulse spike, but delivered correctly, it would remain cloaked in the illusion of generosity. Arthur, understanding the intent, prepared the bottle with careful, theatrical precision. The pop of the cork, the glint of the silver bucket, all orchestrated with just enough subtlety that the family's attention remained divided. When the bottle was placed at the table, Olivia shrieked with delight, assuming the recognition was for her social media presence. Leo's booming declaration about their importance to the restaurant. Mom's whispered astonishment, all completely misattributed. And there I sat, serene, calm, a smile playing on my lips as they clinked glasses, none of them realizing that I had orchestrated the entire scenario using the very rules meant to humiliate me. The pattern continued. Each subsequent visit to the bar involved increasingly rare and expensive selections, all technically allowed, all escalating the cumulative impact of the evening. I maintained the facade of polite compliance, of the grateful, quiet guest, all while leveraging the technicalities to gain control over the situation. I watched my family toast, sip, and marvel at each selection, entirely unaware that the luxury they were consuming was being funneled through the green wristband restrictions in a way that maximized both impact and irony. The contrast between their oblivious indulgence and my calm, deliberate movements was striking, while they were lost in their narratives. Celebrating their own sophistication, I navigated the system with precision. Each glass I ordered, each careful step to and from the bar, each polite exchange with Arthur, was part of a larger, unfolding strategy. The power of silent, calculated observation was intoxicating. The act of playing within the rules, yet bending them completely to my advantage, gave me a quiet thrill that I had never experienced before. With each trip, I made small adjustments, subtle tweaks to the plan that increased both the elegance and the impact of the evening. I varied the vintages, the styles, the rarest selections, always ensuring that they fell under the permissions granted by the limited guest policy. I kept the process smooth, logical, and reasonable in appearance, so as not to draw any suspicion. And each time I returned to the table, the family remained blissfully unaware, laughing, chattering, debating the relative merits of dishes and wines, entirely missing the quiet orchestration behind each glass. I found a rhythm: observe, calculate, act, return, repeat. Each action reinforced the illusion that I was the compliant, gracious guest. Yet with each sip, each carefully orchestrated pour, the cumulative effect of my plan slowly built. The family's assumptions were being exploited, their obliviousness leveraged, and I was watching it unfold with a serene, deliberate satisfaction. My presence was a calm, stabilizing veneer over a quietly subversive series of actions that would eventually culminate in a revelation they would never forget. By the end of the first hour, I had established control. I could order as I pleased, influence the flow of the evening subtly, and maintain complete composure. The family remained caught up in their own bubble of self-importance, entirely misattributing the source of the luxury they were consuming. Each sip, each toast, each delighted comment on the exceptional quality of the drinks reinforced the illusion of my compliance while feeding the growing crescendo of my silent triumph. I returned to the bar one final time before the main courses arrived, feeling the thrill of anticipation, the quiet satisfaction of a plan executed flawlessly. Each movement, each instruction to Arthur, each careful selection had built toward a culmination that would leave them astonished, entirely unaware that I had used the very system designed to humiliate me to claim my own subtle, delicious victory. And as I made my way back, carrying the next rare and extraordinary selection, I realized with quiet delight that the evening had been transformed. The rules that were meant to constrain me had become the tools of my clever, serene revenge. By the time the main courses had arrived, the evening was humming with the familiar energy of my family's self-absorption. Plates of seared steaks, Delicate seafood towers and elaborately garnished dishes paraded before them, and they were lost entirely in the grandeur of it all. Leo was waving his breadstick around as he lectured about class. Olivia was absorbed in her phone and photos, and Mom was whispering details about the social connections she was cataloging around the room. I remained seated, calm, serene, a quiet observer in the eye of the storm I had meticulously orchestrated. Each sip of the expensive wines I had ordered and carefully navigated through Arthur at the bar reinforced the sense of control I had established. I wasn't merely a guest. I was a subtle conductor of this symphony of oblivious indulgence. As the meal drew to a close, the waiter approached with the sleek black leather billfold, a final punctuation to the evening. Traditionally, Dad would have picked it up, his calm hands scanning the total, calculating quietly. But Leo, swollen with the effects of the champagne and cognac, eagerly snatched it, puffed up with confidence that he was handling the evening responsibly. "I've got this one, Dad," he declared, his voice a mix of authority and indulgence, convinced he could cover the total without issue. I kept my expression neutral, a soft, polite smile on my lips, and leaned back slightly, the weight of anticipation settling in my chest. Leo flipped open the billfold, expecting a total within reason for a lavish but manageable celebration. And then he saw it. The numbers, tallied with ruthless precision, stretched before him in stark reality, his face drained of color, eyes widening as he scrolled through the itemized list, his mouth opened, closed, and opened again, a silent, fish-like gasp. What is this?" he whispered, incredulous, voice cracking with disbelief. The table fell into a sudden, tense silence, all eyes drawn toward the source of the shock. Olivia leaned over, frowning, clearly trying to downplay the panic. "Leo, don't be so dramatic." "How bad can it be?" she said, her voice pitched to convey concern. But it lacked any real understanding of the scope. She reached for the bill, attempting to regain control of the narrative, but her perfectly composed face betrayed a flicker of dawning horror as she scanned the numbers herself. I could almost see the puzzle pieces clicking into place in her mind, a realization that this was far beyond the expected indulgence. Mom's hands trembled slightly as she snatched the bill from Olivia, unable to hide her reaction. Her gasp was subtle but audible, a quiet testament to the shock rippling through the room. My father, calm as ever, adjusted his reading glasses, scanned the itemized list, and maintained silence. But I could see it in his eyes, a flicker of respect, a recognition that, at last, someone had played the game they thought they controlled with a precision and cleverness that matched their own meticulous planning. I took a slow sip of water, the ice clinking gently against the glass, allowing a few seconds of silence to settle over the table, heightening the tension. Leo's eyes darted between the lines of the bill and my serene face, his confusion deepening. You ordered this," he stammered, incredulity hanging thick in the air. I placed my glass down with deliberate calm, letting the click of the ice echo in the hush. "Yes," I said evenly, my voice light, conversational, almost casual. "From the management, a gift for the guest of honor, as instructed. It's all in line with the rules you set." I paused, letting the words sink in, giving the room a beat to absorb the magnitude of the situation. The green wristband, the technical boundaries, The explicit allowances, it all became the instrument of my triumph. The tension rippled through the table as they slowly, painfully realized the cleverness of my adherence to the letter while bending the spirit entirely. Olivia's lips parted, her face blanching. "You did this," she whispered, voice trembling between disbelief and rising panic. I smiled softly, serene, letting the calmness in my tone reinforce the contrast with their unraveling composure. I followed the instructions. I replied, "You gave me the wristband, explained the rules, and I decided to see how far those permissions would take me. I didn't break any rules, just exercised them fully." The room grew thick with the weight of realization. Leo's face was blotchy red, eyes wide, jaw slack. The cognac, the salon, everything. That's not house wine," he sputtered, words stumbling over themselves. I leaned slightly forward, voice still calm, conversationally almost cheerful. "I'm not an expert. Leo, I simply requested recommendations from the bartender, as the rules allowed. He was helpful, and, well, I followed through. He wanted me to enjoy myself. Yes, I did, within the guidelines provided." Mom's voice rose, trembling, a mixture of anger and shock. "You tricked us. You deliberately ran up a bill that we can't cover." Her accusation rang through the room, a sharp, almost musical pitch of disbelief. I kept my composure, softening my tone, letting the calmness contrast with the escalating panic around me. "No, I didn't trick anyone," I said evenly. "You gave me the technical framework. The instructions were clear. I simply executed them." The green wristband on my wrist gleamed under the restaurant lights, a visual reminder of the permissions they had granted, a symbol of both their oversight and my calculated response. Leo sputtered again, gesturing wildly at the itemized bill, eyes flicking to Olivia, then Mom, as if looking for reassurance that this was all some terrible mistake. "The salon, the cognac, that's not included. It's impossible." His voice cracked, incredulous, the sound loud enough that a few nearby diners glanced up briefly. Curious, I leaned back slightly, letting the subtle shift in the room's energy reinforce my quiet satisfaction. They were witnessing the consequences of their assumptions, the cumulative effect of a plan executed with precision, calm, and adherence to the rules. Olivia's hands shook as she held the bill, her face contorting through the stages of panic and horror. "No, no, no, no," she choked out almost in disbelief as the enormity of the charges registered. My father remained calm, adjusting his glasses again, scanning the total, and then slowly meeting my eyes. There was a flicker of something there, a quiet approval, recognition that for once, someone had operated with clarity, strategy, and justice within the very system that had been designed to contain them. I set my water glass down deliberately, letting the small click punctuate the tension. "This was the rules you set," I said evenly. "You invited me, provided the wristband, defined what I could have. I simply played within that framework. Any assumptions you made beyond that were your own. I followed the instructions." My voice was calm, conversational, light, almost as if I were describing a casual evening at home rather than the culmination of a masterfully executed act of subtle, strategic justice. A long, stunned silence filled the table. Olivia's eyes darted around, seeking an explanation, a loophole, some rationalization for the chaos I had created within their expectations. Leo's hands were mid-gesture, frozen, his face a canvas of disbelief and dawning panic. Mom's expression was a mix of outrage and humiliation. And Dad, finally, gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, a quiet acknowledgement that, yes, the execution was flawless. The justice delivered not with noise or spectacle, but with calm, calculated adherence to the rules. I let the pause stretch, savoring the mix of shock and dawning comprehension, letting the tension hang in the air, palpable. Each heartbeat, each flicker of their expressions, reinforced my internal sense of triumph. I had not just observed. I had not just complied. I had navigated a web of deliberate cruelty and transformed it into a tableau of subtle, precise justice. Their assumptions, their oblivious confidence, their carefully orchestrated humiliation. It all became the instrument through which I claimed liberation. Finally, I spoke again, softly, conversationally, almost cheerfully, letting the irony of the situation lace my words. It seems, in following the rules as given, that I've ended up with a rather spectacular evening. I hope this serves as a reminder that clear instructions, when taken literally, can have unexpected outcomes. I smiled, serene, calm, letting the full weight of the statement settle on the stunned faces before me. They had engineered the scenario for maximum effect, assuming I would react predictably. And I had played within the system to assert control, clarity, and triumph without ever raising my voice or breaking my composure. The reactions continued in waves, Olivia's whispering, Leo's muttered exclamations, Mom's gasp. And I sat there, calm, collected, the quiet architect of the evening's revelation, the neon wristband, the carefully defined permissions, the oblivious indulgence. They had created the conditions for a masterclass in subtle, precise, and ultimately satisfying retribution. As I sipped my water one last time, I felt the liberation in its purest form. No anger, no guilt, just the calm, serene joy of justice executed perfectly, and the knowledge that their assumptions had finally, spectacularly, been dismantled. When I finally stepped out into the cool night air, it felt like the first clean breath I'd taken in years. The chaos, the cruelty, the absurd performances, they were all behind me. I hadn't just survived the evening. I had quietly turned it into a triumph, a moment of clever, serene justice. The silence that followed wasn't loneliness, it was freedom. And if you've enjoyed seeing a little bit of poetic justice unfold, consider sticking around. Maybe like or subscribe and see what other stories unfold.